Too close. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee. My name is Councillor Camilla Maxood, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Could I remind everyone we are holding this meeting in a way that is COVID secure and in accordance with the Council's social distancing guidelines, which means everyone present is appropriately spread out and has been allocated a specific seat. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the City Council's website so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves. Please remember to turn off your microphone once you've introduced yourself, and I'll start with Kate.
I'm Kate Sadler and I'm the lead officer for this committee.
Good afternoon, Councillor Paul Truswell, and I represent Middleton and Belle Isle.
Afternoon, everybody. Chair, Councillor Pauline Graham, Crossgates and Winmore Ward.
Councillor John Illingworth, representing Kirksall Ward.
Good afternoon, everybody. Gower Almas from Beeston and Holbeck Ward. Thank you.
Victoria Bradshaw, Chief Finance Officer.
Louise Booth, Head of Internal Audit.
Louise Whitworth, Head of Information Management and Governance and Data Protection Officer.
Kieran Dennett, Head of Procurement and Commercial Services.
Mary Hasnip, Head of Finance, Corporate Financial Management.
Afternoon, Chair. Afternoon, everyone. Gareth Mills, Grant Thornton, External Audit.
Good afternoon, everybody. Paminda Sethi, Grant Thornton, External Audit.
Good afternoon, Linda Wild, Independent Member.
Jonathan Bentley, I'm Councillor for Wheatwood. Peter Harrendall, Woodley Ward.
Councillor Jackie Shemelt, Horsforth Ward.
Mike Foster, Councillor for Ardsley and Robin Hood.
Moving on to the agenda, item number 1.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under item 2, there are no exempt or confidential items. Under item 3, I am unaware of any late items of business. Under agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any interests? I'll take that as silent, so I'll assume no interests. Apologies for absence. Agenda item 5. A full House, Chair, with no apologies for absence. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Item number 6, are the minutes a correct recording of the meeting held on the 25th of June?
Yeah, close that.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Item 7, matters arising.
Chair, we've got the Data Protection Officer here, Louise Whitworth, who can update the committee on the PSN application.
Good afternoon, Chair. I can confirm that we have submitted the PSN for the certification this year. We've done that today. So that has gone. Just to make committee aware that the Cabinet Office generally take 4 to 8 weeks before they respond to us. So I will let you know at next committee if we've had feedback from them, or it may well be the committee after that.
Thank you. Do members have any further matters to raise? No? Can we then go to item number 8? Kieran?
Hi, yeah, so agenda item 8, procurement assurance report for 2020-21. So this is a report relating to the council's procurement function and looks to provide assurance that the council's arrangements in relation to procurement are up to date, fit for purpose, effectively communicated and routinely complied with. The report also, as well as looking back to the last financial year, seeks to look forward and give members an understanding of the work that's ongoing and that we're looking to progress in the current year with regard to a review of the whole procure to pay process. So that's the processes and systems that the council's got in place, from procurement through contract management to payment of suppliers in relation to a particular contract. And what we're looking to do is make sure that we're continually improving and that we're making those processes as efficient and effective as possible. As part of that procure to pay review, I'll also touch on the work that we've been doing recently, or rather that's ongoing in relation to reviewing KPIs under the council's procurement strategy and the recent review that we asked the Local Government Association to undertake with regard to procurement practices within the council. So just looking back to last year, I think just to note to begin with that each directorate's accountable for the procurements that they need in relation to the outcomes that they're responsible for, but procurement and commercial services are there to provide support in relation to complex procurement activity, and also to, I suppose, support as well in terms of making sure that individuals within services understand the procurement processes that they ought to be following. Last year there was £992 million worth of external spend, which is an increase on previous years, but that's largely accounted for because of COVID-related grant funding that came in during the year that we spent. Last year, as we do every year, we reviewed the council's contract procedure rules and we strengthened procurement controls within those rules. We also incorporated requirements with regard to seeking social value from procurement activity. And in order to try and deliver additional savings from procurement, we also looked to change the emphasis of the evaluation process for procurement so that it splits the quality and the price. And once you get through the quality threshold, the contract is then awarded based solely on the cheapest price. We don't have that as an absolute requirement on all procurements, but that should be the starting point when considering the appropriate evaluation methodology. In terms of compliance, which the committee's been sort of very keen to keep up to date with previously, there were no procurement challenges in the last year. In terms of on-contract spend, we've got 96.42% of spend in 2020-21 was on contract, which was an increase from 95.6% in the previous year, and it follows a general trend of increasing spend that is on contract. In terms of waivers of CPRs, there were 60 in 2020-21, which was a reduction down from 79 in the previous year. And again, that shows a falling trend over the last few years. I touched a moment ago on the LGA peer review that we invited recently, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. But one of the comments that was made, and I'm raising it in order to support the sort of the assurance position, is that it was noted that there's an outstanding achievement with regard to compliance. that demonstrates efforts by the council to ensure good governance. So I think that's useful for the committee to be aware of. And then the final point, looking back to last year and what we did, we put in place a framework with regard to social value. And that framework includes a social value board that's got membership from services across the council. It's chaired by a Director of Resources. We've also developed social value guidance for commissioners so that they can effectively embed social value into their procurement activity. And we've got identified members of the team in procurement and commercial services who are available to provide support to commissioners with regard to social value. And that itself is supported by an external contract we've got with an organisation called Social Value Portal, who are able to support in terms of making sure that we're adopting social value into our procurement documentation, but they also support by evaluating social value proposals that are put forward by tenderers, and they also are able to monitor social value. And at page 25 of the pack in the appendix to this report, there is an extract from the Social Value Portal website that sets out the social value achieved to date. Looking forward to the current year and beyond, as I mentioned earlier, we are reviewing the totality of our processes and systems relating to social value. We're trying to make social value, to procurement. We're trying to make sure that those processes are as effective and efficient as possible. We're looking at ways to implement technology that would help make sure that where we can do, we are automating those processes. As part of that review, we asked the Local Government Association to arrange a peer review. We had colleagues from procurement in Essex County Council and STAR, which is a regional collaboration of authorities in Greater Manchester. We also had director responsible for transformation from Manchester, and we had exec member from Wigan Council who were part of that peer review. I've seen a draft of the report, but I only got the final report through yesterday, so that's why it's not included in the pack. And there's a couple of tweaks that have been made to the draft recommendations. So, for example, the previous recommendations hadn't included anything about opportunities for implementing new technology to improve efficiency. So that's now been corrected. And so what I will be doing on the back of the recommendations is producing an action plan. And that action plan, I think, will have two elements to it, really. One will be immediate actions that we can undertake. And the other will be sort of longer term actions. So, for example, with regard to immediate actions, we can look to free up some resource that we've currently got in procurement and commercial services to focus on delivering additional value. So, for example, supporting the social value team, and also putting together the sort of specification for new technology that we might want to implement, and focusing on opportunities for savings from procurement activity. And then in the longer term, as part of the procure to pay review, as part of the core business transformation, and we're just starting on the procurement process for a partner to help deliver improved systems, which will, as I said earlier, hopefully would anticipate make the procurement processes more efficient and more automated. That's not going to be an immediate thing that we can do. I think the procurement process is anticipating it will be sort of this time next year before we've completed that procurement, and then we'll be embedded the new systems from then on. So that was all I was going to touch on now. If there's any questions, happy to answer any.
Sorry, Paul.
Chair, I've got 3 questions. I don't know if you want me to fire all 3 off or go through them one by one. I'll go through them one by one. The first one relates to page 24 and the reference to COVID-19. And I do appreciate that this is just a précis of a much more complicated situation. But we know that the national system of procurement and provision of PPE was kind of characterized by chaos, incompetence, waste on an industrial scale, and some rather dodgy allocations of contracts. I suppose my question is, how far did that impact on Leeds City Council, if at all? And what was the context of PPE procurement and provision within the city? What were the challenges that we faced and how did we meet them?
Thank you. In terms of the impact on procurement activity, we did have to dedicate additional resource to procure additional PPE equipment that we weren't necessarily expecting. But we had a PPE framework in place that we were able to utilise, and good relationships with suppliers on the framework enabled us to procure additional PPE through that framework. We'd also managed to maintain good relationships with unsuccessful tenderers, so we were able to use the urgent exceptions within our CPRs and also procurement regs to be able to go back to those other suppliers that had previously been unsuccessful to build on the relationships that we had and procure additional resource PPE through them. So in general terms, I think PPE for us didn't create much of a ripple, but it did take a bit of extra resource and time to make sure that we had those up-to-date arrangements in place.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think we could probably have got more detail, but I'm not going to pursue any more of that. My second question relates to page 25 and the reference to social value. And as we've been told, we have got this sort of dashboard. And I'm not always at my best on a Friday afternoon or at any time as I get older, but looking at these figures, I can't work out whether they represent a good, bad or indifferent set of figures and progress. I look at them and I think this is not very good. And then I look at some of the components that I don't quite understand and think, oh, well, that doesn't look too bad. So could you perhaps just elucidate on that for us?
Yeah, I think to begin with, social value is definitely a work in progress, and there's a lot more that we can be doing to embed social value across the council and make sure that it is being taken into account in all our procurement activity. In terms of the extract from the dashboard that we've included here, I suppose to start with, we've only been putting the contracts through social value portal for a relatively short period of time, so that's reflected in the sort of relatively small number of contracts. But in terms of contract value, you're talking about £10 million, which is not an insignificant sum. And in terms of the extra value that's been committed through those contracts, that's not that it's actually been delivered yet, because it's going to be something that comes over the term of those contracts, which might be 3 or 5 years. You're looking at that 217,000 figure. That's an additional 2% of value on the overall sort of value of the contract. In terms of what's actually been delivered today, again, this is just sort of a relatively short period where we've been reporting. It's that sort of £1,000 figure in the top left-hand corner. I think what we would propose to do is to continue with this dashboard reporting, set some sort of foundation levels, and then look to improve on that year on year as we go through.
Okay, thank you for that, Chair. This is a matter, and obviously you're new to the committee, that we have revisited on a number of occasions, and I don't see any reference in the work programme to us revisiting this, and I think it might be something that we could do after a certain amount of time, because obviously it's very difficult to judge so early in the day. My third question is, could we have a copy? Sorry, I'm on page 31, the Brexit Procurement Regulations Review. Could we have a copy of the response that went in? Because when I see, and I suppose I'm being party political to a degree here, that processes have been bogged down in bureaucratic process-driven procedures. We need to abandon these complicated and stifling rules and unleash the potential of public procurement. Fills me with terror, given the experience we've had over the last year with government procurement. So I think we need to be prepared to to look at the probity and transparency and governance elements that represents. But at the end of the day, obviously, the government will do what the government will do.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's just that's a direct quote from the green paper that was published. But more than happy to share the response that we put together and sent to government. And we're expecting that that the sort of updated legislation will be produced in the next calendar year. And certainly I anticipate that this time next year, when we're providing the report, I'll be able to provide a bit more information about the changes that are actually detailed in there. Sorry, could I just pick up on the social value point as well? We do report annually on spend with local suppliers and SMEs, and that's included in the report as well. And that's been sort of a continual increasing trend each year in terms of how much we do spend locally. I'm just trying to find where it is in the papers. So 65.88% of our spend last year was either with SMEs or local spend, which is up from 64.64 previously.
Sorry, Chair, as that's been raised, do we have any benchmarking to compare what happens in other core cities or other statistical neighbours? Because there are authorities who dine out on the figure of the proportion of contracts that they let locally. And actually, I think Leeds compares very favourably with some of those.
I don't have that here, but I can provide that to the committee.
Councillor Illingworth.
Yes, Chair. First, I'd like to welcome the references to internal reviews and the cycle of control, and particularly peer reviews of other authorities. It seems to me something which is very valuable, and we could do more of it. And so just welcome that. I'd like to ask you about the balance between elected members and officers in this process. I think both groups of people need to be there, but how do you maintain an adequate balance? How do you make sure it's horses for courses and that the review mechanism is appropriate to the problems that we face?
Yeah, so in terms of the LGA review, both Councillor Lewis and Councillor Scopes were involved in that review, given their involvement in procurement over the last few years. And with regard to the recommendations and the action plan that we're going to bring forward as a consequence of the recommendations, I would intend to bring that back to this committee sometime in the autumn. I think we're struggling to identify exactly which meeting it will be at this time, but it certainly will be at some point in the autumn.
Well, just one point I'd like to make it for when you come back. I think it's very patchy at the moment. Some parts of the council review effectively and quickly and learn from it. Other parts are somewhat more fossilised. We all fill in our own individual details of that. But I am anxious that we try to encourage people who don't do reviews to embark on it more effectively. And to have some sort of stirring of the pot to try and move things along a bit.
Councillor Illingworth, just to let you know, we do have a procurement update in the November meeting. Is that all right?
Thanks, Chair. Some of my questions have been answered from Councillor Trussell's question, particularly the Brexit procurement regulations review, which filled me with as much dread. It looks like it's going to be a charter for a free-for-all if we're not careful, so we do need to respond properly to that. On social value, just to try to get a view of this, is this something that goes in as a condition that contractors have to show social value, or is it an extra that will add brownie points to their bid if they put something in? And perhaps you could, just for the benefit of the committee, or benefit from me anyway, just give some examples of that. I know you probably have some in the report, but just so how we value that. And then how does that social value, how is that compatible with the other policy you're talking about, which effectively is price first? What's the hierarchy of doing that? And then a related question in a way, and I think we've asked this before, and it's not really covered in the report, and it might be deliberately not covered in the report, but again, it comes back to value for money, and that is the comparison between what services spend externally and what services spend internally on internal services. So things like Leeds Building Services, Parks and Countryside, the civic enterprise teams, those sorts of things. Because I'm sure many members who are involved with things like housing advisory panels and ward-based initiatives very often get told, well, the only way we can deliver this is if it's an internal delivery, Parks and Countryside particularly, and Leeds Building Services. And that might not always be the best value. So I just wondered if we could address that as well. Thank you, Chair.
So in terms of whether or not social value is a condition or an extra, we've got the local themes, outcomes and measures. So there's a national set of themes, outcomes and measures that look to put a sort of a financial value on different social value that's delivered, and we've produced a Leeds specific version in consultation with other organisations in Leeds and with colleagues across the council. And so we include the Leeds specific TOMs as part of our tender documents, and commissioners for particular contracts are invited as part of the sort of the initial process of setting up their procurement to consider which of those TOMs are most important for their particular contract. So it might be that they identify opportunities for example, work experience or for new job creation and what have you. Or it might be that another contract could focus more on sustainability opportunities. So that's up to the commissioners with support from PACS and with support from Social Value Portal to consider which areas they would wish to highlight. In terms of whether it's a condition, there's 10% is the total evaluation weighting that we suggest should be put towards social value elements. So there's an incentive there on contractors to include social value, and when evaluating that 10%, we want to be have some degree of assurance that they're actually going to be able to deliver that, and that's where sort of Social Value Portal are very helpful. So typically it's an extra. You get additional marks as part of the evaluation if you put more social value commitments into your tender, but on a contract by contract basis, it might be that a particular commissioner wants a particular identified social value opportunity to be a condition, and that's a sort of a pass-fail element. So the answer is it could be either, but the starting point that I'd anticipate typically is that it's an extra. And in terms of, I suppose, jumping a little bit onto your query about sort of the price first hierarchy, it shouldn't be the case that social value impacts on price. It's part of the overall procurement. So social value should very much be, from our perspective, an extra that we're getting above and beyond. And from a provider's perspective, if they start pricing in the extra social value commitments that they include, then they'll be negatively evaluated for price. So really, they shouldn't be pricing those in as an extra either. And I think in terms of government review and analysis of social value that's been achieved through public sector contracts, I think typically the response is that by focusing on social value and trying to drive additional value from your contracts, you shouldn't be increasing the price of those contracts. You shouldn't anticipate seeing those. It's not a zero sort of sum game in that respect. And certainly that was the feedback we got from LGA as part of the peer review that they did recently, that we shouldn't be afraid of pushing social value more, because typically you don't see that coming through as resulting in an increase in price. In terms of examples of social value, I think one of the most obvious and easy examples is companies providing volunteering opportunities. So, their staff who they make them available to work in volunteering across Leeds. And what we're in the process of doing is working with the third sector to come up with a pool of opportunities for people. So what we don't want is people volunteering for something that doesn't actually accord with our priorities or the third sector priorities in Leeds. So we're trying to come up with this pool of opportunities within the third sector that we can actually deliver some real value from volunteering. Other examples is sustainability, and we had some schools rebuilds a few years ago where I think it was something like 99% of the waste was recycled or reused, which was really positive. And then sort of sticking on the theme of schools, we had one of our contractors recently who during the pandemic was able to provide a number of laptops for children in the community so that they were able to do their schooling at home when they weren't able to come into school. I think that's all the questions. If there was anything else to follow up.
Sorry, Chair. My second question about use of internal resources.
Sorry, yeah. So in terms of the processes that we've got in place, at the outset of a procurement, we should be undertaking an analysis of whether we've got any internal service providers who are able to provide that particular service that we're looking for. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use those internal service providers, but they should certainly be the starting point. If there's a business case for going externally, then that needs to be demonstrated.
So in cases of, say, let's take Parks and Countryside, which is a one which is widely used for the provision of, say, play equipment. The impression I get as an elected member, and I don't know if other elected members are the same, is that provision of play equipment is wholly down to Parks and Countryside. For them, not just the purchase of it, but the installation and the management and the project management of a scheme, and there's no negotiation about that. So how often do you come into that sort of conflict or a competitive environment where you have an internal provider and an external provider, internal service provider and external contractor? Is it a common thing, or do people tend just to go with the internal provider, which is my impression? It's almost like that's what we do.
Well, yeah, the starting point under our contracts procedure rules is that we should be using internal providers in the first instance. If not wanting to focus on Parks and Countryside, but if there was an issue with an internal provider, say, for example, they haven't delivered previously or they were proving more costly or anything like that, it's then to build a business case to go externally on that basis. But the first starting point should be you're using the internal service provider, and that might be Parks and Countryside, it might be LBS, those kind of catering as well, things like that.
Thank you. I won't pursue it any further. Thanks.
Councillor Harrand.
Thanks, Chair. My first one is a supplementary to Councillor Trustwell's about, I think, asking about apparently rash government expenditure on PPE and associated things in the last 18 months. Can we have the assurance that none of that expenditure, which is certainly difficult for us to defend, landed on our revenue account? That was all centrally suffered, was it? I hope. Just say yes.
No, Councillor.
Might not be yes.
Councillor Harrand, where's the governance question in that? Sorry,
the audit. I'll make sure that the audit question is, I'm auditing none of the expenditure we've incurred had been incurred as a result of government difficult to defend contracts. It's legitimate, is that?
The council's got its own.
Kieran, would you like to answer that or not?
Yeah, that's fine. The council's got its own PPE contracts in place that we utilised last year. As far as I'm aware, there was no utilisation of any central government contracts in that regard, but I'm happy to go away and double check if that's helpful for you.
I'll spend more than 2 minutes on it, but if the answer is yes, that's fine. Can I ask also if there's anywhere an analysis of the reason for waivers? Once a week, we waive our CPRs. If somebody analyse those, tell us why we think that's appropriate, that some of the officers do that. There's also mention later on in the paper about extensions to contracts. CPR 20 was clarified to make it perfectly clear that a contract cannot be extended once it's expired. Can we have a similar assurance that that does not happen? Waivers first.
Yeah, sorry, with regard to waivers, in terms of the reasons, I think what we typically find is that the majority of those sort of 60 waivers that I've referred to there probably weren't needed in the first place. So for example, there'd be relatively low value in the context of the council's CPR, so less than £25,000, where a direct award could have been made in any event. But the individuals concerned within the services have gone through the process of putting a waiver report in place and a waiver decision in place. And one of the, I suppose, issues is that despite including in the CPRs that prior to implementing a waiver decision, the individual should come and consult with procurement commercial services first. That doesn't happen in every circumstance. So you do find that some waivers are decisions are taken where they're not required. So with regard to, I suppose, the point you're making about that's, you know, more than one a week, the truth of the situation is that the vast majority of those weren't actually required in the first place. There's enough flexibility in CPRs. So I think there's, you know, a continuing task for procurement commercial services to make sure that we're educating colleagues, make sure that they're aware and the relevant trainings there. And also getting the message across that before you actually go and take a decision with regard to waivers, come and talk to us first and we'll be able to point you in the right direction.
Thank you. I think I understood that there aren't any serious waivers. Is that's between the lines, is it? That's what you're telling us.
There aren't any serious
substantial waivers.
Not as far as I'm aware. I think in terms of the overall value, it's, you know, a few fractions of a percent.
And the question about extensions to contracts, somebody's made the point that it cannot happen. Is there a reason we've underlined that? Has it been happening?
Contracts shouldn't be extended, but in the context of COVID, there has been the opportunity to put in place urgent sort of variations in that regard. But typically, no, it wouldn't be happening.
Councillor Truswell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to Councillor Hammond for identifying my total failure to follow up on one of the components of one of my earlier questions. And I suppose, to try and put it in plain language, is did we as an authority incur any additional expenditure for providing PPE that should have come through national sources, either ourselves or partner organisations like the NHS? I think that's the question, isn't it, really, that we're getting at.
Well, we incurred the expenditure on PPE that we required for our needs. Yeah.
Yeah, the government signed some remarkable contracts in the first few months of COVID. I just want to ensure that none of it mounts back onto our revenue account. Well, I think that's what I'm hearing. Somebody wants to say that in so many words.
In terms of the national contracts that government put in place, we wouldn't have utilised those. We have our own contracts in place that we utilised for PPE.
Sorry, just a quick one. On page 25, I think you refer to the social value project with you guys working with your partners. Is that SVP? Can you just explain who your partners are in this project and what the relationship is?
So Social Value Portal is a separate organisation. It's a separate company. The individuals who are involved in social value portal have got extensive experience on social value matters and supporting government in developing these national themes, outcomes and measures that I mentioned earlier. In terms of our relationship, we procured social value portal under a contract to provide support to us. It's a 3-year contract, and we're, I think, probably about just over 15 months into that contract. So we will be in the not too distant future reviewing future opportunities and options with regard to how we deliver and monitor social value. And it might be that we continue with social value portal. It might be that we do something different.
Could you tell me the value of that contract?
So the cost to the council is about, I think it's about £7,500 a year. So it's not very much. But how social value portal price it for us, they do it differently for different authorities, and we've done an analysis of the different options. The way that they price the contract for us is that they will a percentage of the overall contract value will be recharged back to the successful tenderer.
Is that all right, Councillor Foster? Any other questions? Kieran, can I ask a few questions, please? Para 4.9 of the appendix, page 26, refers to the replacement for YOR, your tender, to go live in January 22. Can I ask, are arrangements in place to ensure relevant staff are trained and supported in the use of the use of the system before it goes live?
Yes, so we've currently got our existing e-tendering platform, and we've concluded the procurement for a new e-tendering platform, which is the one that goes live at the end of this calendar year. So there is a degree of overlap between the two. We've got, and we can run the two systems alongside each other in order to make sure that staff are fully trained and understand how to use the system once the other system disappears.
Page 23 and 27, para 2.6 and 4.12 of the appendix refers to the opportunity to improve connectivity between procurement and commercial service and colleagues undertaking procurement activity within directorates. Will this form part of the focus in the action plan you propose?
Yes, it will. In terms of immediate opportunities for improving connectivity, well, I suppose just to as a starting point, procurement commercial services provide support to colleagues across the council. There are some procurement staff who are currently embedded in services, so for example, highways, DIS and housing. But for the rest of the procurement activity across the council, procurement commercial services is available to provide support in that regard. And we also do work closely with colleagues in those other service areas who've got their own procurement staff embedded. But we can certainly improve that connectivity. And one of the proposals that we've got is a 12-month pilot for a commercial business partner to actually work within services. And to provide that connectivity that you talk about between packs and between the services, so that, and also I suppose help foster a relationship where it's kind of doing with rather than doing to. So that's one of the immediate things that we're doing, and hopefully that pilot demonstrates some value in terms of outputs from contracts, but also in terms of savings, and we can put together a business case to roll that pilot out for the longer future, and also to apply to other directorates as well. And then in the longer term, as part of the procure to pay review, we are reviewing systems and processes across the council to try and make sure that it is all joined up. And it might be that there's a review of where people sit on the structure, or that we have kind of what are referred to as dotted lines between different people in different service areas. But that's part of the wider review that will sort of come in the next 12 months or so.
And the last one, Kieran, paragraph 3, page 23 of your report suggests that resource should be should focus on delivering greater strategic value from procurement. What assurances are you able to give the committee that this refocusing will not detract from the culture of compliance, please?
So we've got a team of 8 individuals who provide procurement support within my service, but to procurements across the council. What we're looking to do is to take a small number of those. I think currently we're thinking 2 or 3 FTE from that group to focus more on making sure that we can embed social value better into all our procurements, to working on specifying the new system that we're looking to put in place to help deliver procurement activity, and also to deal with spend, and also to focus on savings, which, you know, obviously are an immediate priority for the council, and so to help get the data that will inform, you know, which contracts we should be looking at to identify savings from. But what we won't be doing is you know, getting rid of that team completely. The vast majority of that team will still continue to focus on compliance, and making sure that spend is still on contract, monitoring waivers, and I'll be reporting back to this board as well, this committee as well, about that in due course.
Thank you, Kieran. Any more questions from members? Thank you. Does the committee agree the recommendations set out on page 17 of the agenda pack? A, consider and note the assurances provided in this report from the review, assessment and ongoing monitoring carried out. B, note that the head of procurement and commercial services has reached the opinion that procurement policies and practices are up to date, fit for purpose and effectively communicated. And C, note the ongoing P2P review, the ongoing analysis of progress towards achieving the procurement strategy, KPIs, and the anticipated proposal from the LGA peer review to focus resource on delivering greater strategic value from procurement activity, and that a further report will be provided to the committee with detail in this regard. Thank you. Can we now move on to item 9? Kate, are you going to make this report?
So this is the annual decision-making report that members have come to know and love. It covers the period from April 2020 to March 21, but I've also added in the figures for the first quarter of this year so that you can see that we're starting to move on past the emergency period of COVID. The statement of internal control in full glorious technicolor sets out the full cycle of internal control for you, and I'm not going to reiterate the contents of that report because you've had the opportunity to read it. Should there be any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Kate. Any questions from members?
Chair, can I just say that's the most useful introduction to a report I've heard for years.
Kate, sorry, can I ask? Para 22 and para 23, page 43 of the appendix, refer to the importance of arrangements to ensure decision makers have access to professional advice and guidance in relation to their decisions. Are you able to provide assurance that this advice and guidance is available and accessible? Thank you.
There is a cohort of staff who are there to give advice and guidance. So obviously staff in legal give advice on behalf of the city system, staff in finance give advice on behalf of the chief finance officer. We've got colleagues in human resources. The recent survey of internal control, which I discuss more in a later report in the agenda, did ask questions throughout about access to advice in legal, in finance, in PACs, in human resources, and in relation to land and property within the council. So we do have assurance that there is awareness of the arrangements for getting that advice and that those arrangements are being complied with. And the results of that have been considered. There was reference in the procurement report, for example, about improving that connectivity.
Thank you, Kate. Any other questions? Okay, sorry, John Illingworth, sorry. You want to ask something?
I was two minds whether to ask the question or not, and it's about revisiting decisions. One of the things it's often struck me that Leeds isn't particularly good at is going back to review a decision after the event. I could think of policy changes which didn't have the desired effect and which were, the decision maker never really knew that it hadn't worked, I felt at the time. And I think specific examples, I give more time to pull them together, but basically going back to look at the planning consent that we've agreed to, revisit the policy that we've done on cleansing, for example. I think there's lots and lots of examples around the authority where full of good intentions, we did our best, but it didn't work. And it seems to me that we will benefit from revisiting, identifying cases to have a second look at what happened in reality.
I think the answer to that somewhat lies in scrutiny.
Yeah.
The role of this committee is rather more about whether there are arrangements and processes in place, and scrutiny is more about the choices and the outcomes from those arrangements and processes. So it would be use the scrutiny board procedure rules, make that reference through the scrutiny chairs, to be considered through the appropriate board's agenda if there is a particular area of concern, councillor.
That is what happens in theory. In practice, is a very narrow window of opportunity that scrutiny boards tend to fill up their agenda in the spring, early summer, and then have a rush to complete it by the end of the municipal year. And it's actually quite difficult to inject anything else into the programme because if you haven't actually got the pot on the boil in May or June, you're not going to get on the agenda, and that is a silly restriction.
John, that's for the to take that up with the scrutiny boards. Yeah.
Yes, but we're talking about efficient administration, and I would identify that as an inefficiency, that there's a very narrow window to get reviews.
Councillor Bentley.
It's going to be a very rare occurrence. I'm actually supporting what John says in this occasion. And it's a question I often ask of Audit, of how you close the loop, that particularly on projects, that when do you inspect what you expected? And scrutiny board is a very sort of, it's almost a nuclear option when you go to scrutiny board, and scrutiny board have to consider it at that because there's so much else to do. But it's doing it as a routine. I think that's and I have it built into our processes. And I would tend to agree that I mean, I have a hobby horse about the in-cab technology for our refuse collection, which goes back to probably 7-8 years, and it was going to solve all the issues that we had about missed bins and all these other issues, and we're still getting those issues, and we're still getting the excuse, oh well, it's a new crew, they didn't know the route, whereas the in-cab technology was supposed to take down a sat nav and direct the crew, and so it didn't really matter. And that's one that I sort of use an example quite often, that we know, but I'm sure there's lots of others where we've not closed that loop and inspected what we expected.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Chair. No disrespect to any scrutiny chairs, but having been the scrutiny chair for many years, and also this board, at scrutiny, you can put something on the agenda and it's not decided at the beginning. As you know, John, we've been on boards together. So I would think if something was put to the chair that they wanted to look at this and it was important, which most things are that are on scrutiny or should be, then there should be no issue with having that a one-off agenda item. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, councillor Graham. Okay, can we move on, please? Does the committee agree the recommendations set out on page 33 of the agenda pack? Consider and note the positive assurances set out in the decision-making statement of internal control attached as Appendix A to the report. Request that performance monitoring in respect of decision taken under urgency procedures and subject to calling should be reported quarterly through the internal audit update report. Thank you. Item 10, Kate, thank you.
So this report presents to committee the interim annual governance statement. It's part way along its journey to coming back to committee, hopefully in November this year, for approval as a final version when it will be updated. It has been circulated to committee, so you've had an opportunity to comment, and I've incorporated those comments that I had received prior to the meeting.
Thank you, Kate. Are there any questions from members? Councillor Truswell?
Yeah, Chair, it's probably slightly pedantic, but it's Friday afternoon. On page 72, we're given a table with for governance code and what we have as our own LCC, corporate governance code and framework. And there are 7 components to it. Now, 6 of them I've got no problem with. What we say in ours is very much reflects, albeit in slightly different wording, what CIPFA is saying. But right at the bottom of page 72, D, which I think is also number 5, CIPFA's code says determining the interventions necessary to optimize the achievement of intended outcomes. Our version is take informed and transparent decisions. And I just don't feel, as with the others, that the former translates into the latter. So I'm kind of just wanting an explanation as to why there isn't that clear flow between the two.
If I'm brutally honest, councillor, I scratched my head a little bit as well when I came to align the two, one to the other. This is the Corporate Governance Code and Framework, as was adopted through this committee back in 2017. I think Councillor Graham was chair of the committee at the time when it was adopted. I have looked at it. I think it's probably time that we reviewed the code and framework anyway. So I would be more than happy to take forward as a work item from the committee to formally review the code and framework and to look at whether that wording does need adjusting.
Would members like to see that?
Yes.
Happy to take that forward. Thank you. Councillor Bentley?
Yeah, just a very quick one on page 79, paragraph 12.2, where it says our scrutiny function is well resourced and developed, which I'm not going to comment on, but the last bit, and is afforded parity of esteem with the executive. What's the how was that particular conclusion reached, and what's the evidence on that?
This is one of those ones where I say the annual governance statement was reached in part as a result of inquiries with colleagues with suitable experience and seniority to provide me with the outcome. So our colleagues in scrutiny, the annual scrutiny report, and the information that they've provided is the information on which I have based that parity of esteem comment.
Do you know whether scrutiny chairs were invited to comment on that?
I understand that the scrutiny chairs are those who agree the annual scrutiny report, from where that comes.
Any more questions? Does the committee agree the recommendations are set out on page 71 of the agenda pack to consider the draft interim AGS and note that it will be published alongside the statement of accounts when put on deposit. Thank you. Item 11, can I invite Mary Hasnap to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. So the report presents the draft statement of accounts, which at this stage in the process are coming to members for information. So the 6-week public inspection period for the accounts will start on Monday, and Grant Thornton's audit will also be starting very shortly. And once that is complete, hopefully in November, the final audited accounts with any necessary adjustments will be brought back to the committee, and it's at that stage that the committee will be asked to approve them on behalf of the council. The accounts are produced in line with technical accounting standards, so the position presented in the income and expenditure account is a little different from what members may be used to seeing in terms of an outturn report. There are technical accounting entries for issues like depreciation, impairments, IAS 19 pensions, but I think this year the I&E account does clearly show the impact of the pandemic in terms of particularly the council's balance of funding, in that there is a big increase in government grant funding and a big reduction in particularly business rates, local taxation income. I should also mention that in addition to the general government grants line increase, there is also some specific directorate specific COVID grant income included within the gross income figures for specific services. And there is an explanatory note 8, which gives the year-on-year comparison for government grants included in specific services. On the subject of business rates income, I should also mention that there is a non-COVID factor there as well, in that 2019-20 we were part of a 75% pilot for business rates retention, whereas for this year 2021 that's back to a 50% business rates retention. So there would always have been, even without COVID, a reduction in our business rates income for this year. Turning to the balance sheet, there has been a significant increase in our level of spendable reserves, but it's important to note that the vast majority of that is in relation to grants received in advance, and particularly in relation to shortfalls on collection fund income. I should also mention that in terms of the valuation of land and property assets, other than for housing dwellings, our valuers have advised again this year that there is a material uncertainty factor in respect of the rest of the property valuations. And that's in line with Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors national advice, which their guidance on material uncertainty was actually in force until mid-May this year. Also on the balance sheet, you'll see that there's been big increases in both debtors and creditors. In terms of the debtors increase, that's not, as you might suspect, to do with difficulties in collecting income. There's actually two factors in there. The first is that there's been an increase of 34.9 million in the amounts that we're due from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority for agreed funding for capital projects. And there's also an increase of 103.7 million of debtors from MHCLG in relation to collection fund income, with 84 million of that relating to the government's 50% share of the deficit on the collection fund. Sort of mirroring that within the creditors increase, there's an increase of 74.7 million, again, that we need to pay back to MHCLG, which is to do with repayable grants that we've received in advance during the year to cover the impact of the additional reliefs that have been given to businesses to offset their losses. That was all I wanted to highlight in terms of the figures in the accounts. In recent years, we have been running informal sessions between the draft accounts coming to committee and the final accounts coming to committee for members to have the opportunity to ask any detailed questions that they want to ask about the accounts outside of this forum. So we're very happy to run those again this year if members would like that. possibly in September, October after the holiday season. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions now that members have on the accounts.
Thank you, Mary. Any questions from members? Councillor Harrand?
Do returning officers get their salaries even if there are no elections? Page 176.
As far as I understand it, Chair, for national elections, that is a specific payment that only happens when such an election happens.
But the answer is no, they don't get paid if there are no elections.
That's correct, Councillor, yes.
Any other questions? Councillor Schmelt?
Who are the valuers? Are they internal or are they external for land and property, etc.?
Councillor, the vast majority of the non-housing stock is valued internally. For the housing stock, we employ the District Valuer's Office to provide advice on those. And we do employ specialist external valuers specifically for the PFI waste plant, because that's such a specialist asset that we don't have the capacity to do it internally.
Thank you for that. If we're having an additional session later on in the year to discuss certain things, then I won't pursue it any further, but just a couple of observations that, given the uncertainties of the last 18 months or so in terms of property and valuations, then I would like to drill down into that a bit better when we have a more detailed session. And the other thing is that the pension accrual has changed dramatically, which is fairly normal, but the West Yorkshire Pension Fund hasn't had an actuarial valuation since 2019. I'm assuming that that's usual for that to happen every 3 years. Is that the case? So there will be another one in 2022?
Yes, there will be a triennial valuation due in 2022. I should also explain, Councillor, that the position in the accounts on the balance sheet isn't on the same basis as a triennial review for the pension funds. So when they do the triennial review, they're taking a forward-looking view. So because we have a funded scheme, at that point in time, they will assess the extent to which the assets will earn income before the liabilities become payable, whereas the position on the balance sheet is purely the value of the assets that we have now and the net present value of the liabilities. So it doesn't take into account the extent to which you would expect those assets to earn income before the liabilities become payable. So you will always see a bigger deficit on the statement of accounts than on a funding assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Almas?
Thanks, Chair. Page 177. My question is around the costs of compulsory redundancy and other levers. On page 178, the table shows 2019, 2020 in terms of compulsory redundancies figures, which is sort of consistent. But would I be right to assume in terms of other levers that's sort of connected to the pandemic, or could that be please explained, because there's a big difference from the previous year, 2019, 2020 and 2021, please. Thank you. And what exactly are other levers? Some examples, please.
Councillor, yes, the vast majority of those other levers will be people who left under the ELI scheme that we launched during 2021 as part of the response to the pandemic. There will be a small number of other levers within there, but the vast majority are due to the ELI scheme.
Thank you, Mary. Any other questions from members? Does the committee agree the recommendations set out on page 105 of the agenda pack? Note the unaudited statement of accounts for 2020-21, which have been certified by the Chief Finance Officer. Thank you. Item 12, I'd like to invite Gareth Mills to present the external audit plan. Thank you, Gareth.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'll kick off and hand over to Parminder in a moment. So just in terms of some of the key headline messages from this document, this is our 2021 audit plan. It sets out the key risks as we see it in terms of the accounts audit and the accounts that Mary's just presented. On page 235, we set out a summary of the financial position of the council. And again, just to confirm that Parminder and I continue to meet on a very regular basis with Victoria, with Richard and Mary and the team. And that dialogue has continued on a regular basis throughout the year in order to keep up to speed in terms of the financial position of the authority and the various financial challenges. The other couple of things to mention on that page, Chair, one is the new auditing standard, ISO 540, which requires auditors to look at key areas of estimate and disclosure in a more detailed manner than previously. And then the final point on that page is something we've talked about quite a bit at this committee in terms of the expectations of our regulators in terms of the increasing raising of the bar, if you like, in terms of audit documentation and audit quality. Just over the page on page 236, in terms of some of the headlines, again, the significant risks on the audits are the areas where we're going to pay particular audit focus and attention. They're listed there. They're ones that, again, will be familiar to certain members of the committee. They're the key risks that we've had in recent years. And they are around, in most cases, the valuation of the very high value areas of the balance sheet, some of which we've just touched on in Mary's presentation, around the valuation of your land and buildings, your investment properties, and the pension fund liability. So those are balances where they're subject to a great deal of assumptions, estimate, judgment, use of experts on your side, and indeed we as auditors use our own experts to challenge some of those assumptions and get the required level of audit assurance over them. Materiality is broadly in line with the prior year. At last week's training session that we ran last Friday, which hopefully members found helpful, we talked quite a bit around the new value for money arrangements review. So that's clearly going to be a key piece of work that we'll be performing throughout the rest of the year, with a particular look around the overall financial position of the authority. And again, audit logistics, we spoke quite a bit at the last meeting and indeed last Friday around the arrangements in place around the audit fee and some of the reasons why that fee has gone up, and also around the audit timetable and why we're working towards a November sign-off date as opposed to September. So I won't dwell on those, given that we discussed those at some length last week. I'll hand over to Parminder if there's anything else Parminder just wants to draw out. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Gareth. If I could draw your attention to a few particular points, just on page 237, the authority doesn't produce group accounts at the moment, and you are involved with a number of entities, including 3 subsidiaries. As part of our work, we will be looking at your assessment around that to be satisfied that group accounts are not appropriate at Leeds. The risks Gareth sort of highlighted from page 238 for the next 4 pages. There's just a couple I just want to sort of particularly refer to. There are 2 risks that all auditors are required to consider. One is around the risk of fraud in revenue recognition and also expenditure, which is on page 238. That particular risk, given there's little incentive for the authority to manipulate revenue or major income streams, and the fact that you've got good ethical frameworks in place has allowed us to rebut that particular risk. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we're not going to be doing any work around those areas. We will be undertaking quite a lot of detailed work, but it's not considered an enhanced risk and therefore is not a significant risk on the basis that it's been rebutted.
The other area, which is on page 239, is the management override of controls. Again, all auditors are required to consider that risk. And that's around the potential for management to take action to manipulate the outturn position of the authority. And in that regard, particular areas of work we will undertake relate to journals testing, and in particular, looking at management estimates and those types of transactions where it's not clear and there is a degree of judgment that you can use to put numbers into your account. The next few pages touch on, I think, as Gareth has already mentioned, significant risk around the valuation of land and buildings, investment properties, and of course, the pension fund. They are very significant pieces of work and involve quite a lot of detail, particularly around the valuation of property, plant and equipment. And we undertake quite a lot of detailed work. And as regards on pensions, we do rely on the experts that the authority uses to provide valuations to the council. Gareth also mentioned ISA 540, that's around accounting estimates. The additional work this year has arisen because the Financial Reporting Council has issued an updated ISA. And what that means really is that we'll be looking a lot more in depth at management's arrangements for determining accounting estimates, how they've calculated them, the basis on which those judgments have been made to determine what the estimate ought to be. But there is a role here now for the Audit Committee too. The Audit Committee needs to review the estimates and judgments that management has made and be satisfied, as those charged with governance, that the estimates that have been made are appropriate. Over the page on page 244, we've just set out some of the material estimates we think may be the ones that will be produced. Of course, valuation of land and buildings we've touched on, as we have on pensions, but there are other areas, for example, depreciation, that may fall within those. And in that regard, we have issued a paper to management where they can actually provide that assessment in the key areas. And I believe that will be coming to the committee during September, but we have requested that we could have that earlier for our audit work during the summer, so we can use that as part of our audit. Page 246, there are other matters that we have an audit responsibility for, which are set out there. We obviously review the narrative report. We also look at the annual governance statement to ensure that it sort of meets what our understanding of the council is, but of course also discloses all the particular areas required by SIPFA. The other area that you're probably aware of is that we will consider any queries raised by electors that are raised as part of our work too. On the right hand side of that particular page, we've drawn attention to going concern. Going concern obviously is a particular issue in all organisations during the pandemic, less so now for public sector bodies following the issue of Practice Note 10. So the focus on going concern perhaps may be considered a little bit less than it has been in previous years. But nonetheless, given the financial pressures that the council has been facing, that will be something that we will be looking at quite closely. And in particular, management assessment, management's own assessment of going concern. The next page on page 247 of the pack really draws out a follow-up of the recommendations that we made last year and the action that's been taken so far to date. So there were 7 recommendations we made in our ISA report last year. Management of action 3 of those recommendations, 3 remain ongoing and 1 hasn't been actioned. And the one that hasn't been actioned relates to obtaining valuation of property at the end of the financial year, 31st of March. Now, traditionally, that was done earlier in the year. Last year, the authority moved to valuation at the 30th of September. And we understand from this year, the valuation date has been now moved to the 1st of January. So you're getting to the end of the year, but I think that recommendation still remains from our perspective. Materiality, Gareth has set out and referred to already. Value for money is on page 250 of the pack. There are 3 key criteria, new areas of work that we'll be undertaking under the new code this year, and that's financial sustainability, governance, and improvements in economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. On the basis of our planning work so far, we've not identified any significant weaknesses at the council except for the overall financial position. And that follows on from the qualified except for value for money conclusion that we raised last year. And it mirrors a lot of authorities that are in financial, under a lot of financial pressure because of the impacts of the pandemic. Our timetable and audit logistics are set out on page 252, and we're targeting to sign off, assuming all audit work is completed by the 30th of November. Our audit fees are set out on the following page under section 12. The fees are the same as we reported in our audit update report to the audit committee back in June. And finally, on page 255, we are required to disclose any independence or non-audit services that we provide. There are no independence issues, and we don't provide any non-audit services to the authority during this current year. The appendix, just for information, sets out the changes to the various standards and application guidance that we need to comply with as part of our audit for this year. So it just sets out the significant change and the depth of work that we will be required to undertake. I'll pause there, but happy to take questions.
Thank you, Parminder and Gareth. Questions from members? Councillor Truswell.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth and Parminder. Just two very quick questions. On page 243, there is reference, and you did speak about this, Parminder, to specifically do corporate governance and audit committee members, and then there are 3 questions. And I have to say, when I read this, it felt like that nightmare where you're doing an examination the following day and you've not even taken the course. So I suppose the question to ourselves is, what are we going to do to ensure that A, we understand the questions, and B, we can answer them in the affirmative? And the second point is on page 249, materiality. And it's the final paragraph where it says, if management have corrected material misstatements identified during the course of the audit, we will consider whether these corrections should be communicated to this committee. And I'm just wondering how you will decide what might come to this committee and what might not. And would it not be easier just to let us have the whole kit and caboodle?
Okay, perhaps if I can take the second question first. As regards materiality, we've set a trivial figure of 1.3 million, which is set out on page 249. So what that really means is that anything below that we wouldn't really consider would impact on the opinion on our audit, and therefore we wouldn't normally report that unless we felt there was a reason for it. So anything above that, if even management process it, we will take a view, and it would normally be included as adjusted by management. So in one of the schedules, it will clearly set out either we've identified it and it's been adjusted, or whether it's been made by management. So there's clarity as to why it's been done and by who. So that's the first point. And then just going back to the other matters which are on page 243. There is a pack that I know management will be bringing, which sort of sets out what the estimates are, what work they've done on them, and the impact of those, which should hopefully help the audit committee, those charged with governance, in answering some of those questions. I'll pause there for Gareth.
Yeah. Thanks, Marina. I think the key parts of the the reference of your responsibility probably will come through the sessions that Mary has offered to do. And as part of that, I'm sure Mary will set out where Mary and the rest of the finance team have made those key judgments and their rationale for doing so. And that will be, as I say, documented in a report that will come to this committee towards the end of September, Councillor Trustwell. So hopefully that will give members you know, the assurance and the ability to understand the rationale of management arriving at that judgment, which you will either concur with or raise further questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, Chair, the reason I asked the question is that I understood the paragraph before and the clearly trivial figure, so I didn't understand the need for the final paragraph because it seemed to qualify it in some way. But I think members of the public, it's almost like blood donor sketch, you know, 1.3 million may be trivial to some people, but it's a bloody fortune to some poor beggar. And I think there needs to be some understanding of that figure.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Trustwell. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I had a similar one at a very similar committee yesterday, actually. And obviously, we don't audit to the penny. We have to audit to a materiality level that we can give a reasonable level of assurance that the accounts give a true and fair view and are free from material error. And obviously, in arriving at that, we have a calculation methodology to give a materiality figure based on a percentage of your total spend. But in order to still capture lower level adjustments or errors, we do have that triviality figure, and we've got to set it at some point, and it's typically around sort of 5% of the headline level of materiality. So as Perminder said, in reality, in the Leeds ISA 260 that is expected to come to this committee in November, you know, were we to find any adjustments or errors or amendments around about that 1.3 million figure, they would be all included, and then you'd have that sort of complete picture. Thanks, Chair.
Can I just add one further point to that? And that is that materiality figure would really only apply if it really didn't impact on your outturn position. So anything smaller than that would sort of move you from maybe a surplus position to a deficit position, we would routinely report that to you anyway, because it would be material by nature.
Thank you. Councillor Almas.
Thanks, Chair. I'd just like some clarity around the audit fees, which is number 12 on page 253. Looking at the actual fees, obviously it's since 2017-18, it has come, the actual fees, I mean, the PSAA scale fee has come down from 231,953 to 178,000. With the fee uplift, proposed uplift of 97,000, which you have shown the breakdown in the detailed analysis, it says proposed increase to agreed from 2019-2020 was 37,250. So would I be right in thinking the proposed fee in terms of the actual PSA scale fee be increased to £37,000, or is that just the fee uplift that was agreed?
Thanks, Councillor. As we know from previous discussions, obviously there's quite a bit of sensitivity around the audit fee. Now, if we had the page, if we had the space on this page and we went back to the audit fee for this council when I started as a SITFA trainee 19 years ago, it was about £500,000. So over that period of time, with the demise of the Audit Commission, etc., the scale fee has reduced quite significantly. So that's the reason, you know, one of the reasons why the base scale fee is much reduced. In terms of the fee uplift that we've proposed for this year, it effectively incorporates the uplift from previous years around the level of detailed work that we're now doing on the valuation of your estate, the pension fund valuation. Those are effectively, what we're effectively saying is that those are continuing ongoing pieces of work. And then the bit that's really new for this year is twofold. One is the new VFM arrangements review, which is being performed for the first time this year. And as we said on the session last week, you know, it's a much more wide-ranging, detailed piece of work than the previous VFM review. And then secondly, you know, the new standards coming in terms of the expectations around the level of detailed work we do. I suppose a couple of other things to mention on the fee is, and I think we touched on this in the progress report that we did at the last meeting, obviously the Redmond Review and MHCLG have both acknowledged that audit fees have become too low for the level of audit work that audit firms are performing on local authority accounts. And as such, they made 15 million available to the sector. I think it was announced just today, I can see Victoria nodding now, that 15 million is going to be distributed. But certainly when we were planning this, the expectation would be that all or substantially all of that 97 uplift would be covered by Leeds' portion of the 15 million that's been made available. And I think the other expectation is that the uplifts that auditors are proposing this year, they're expected to continue on that basis, i.e. there's not another 97,000 to come next year. There's an expectation that the uplift for this year should run broadly for the rest of the contract, which is 2 years or potentially 4 years if PSAA extend the contract period. So I think that, I acknowledge there's a big uplift this year in terms of both value and percentage. It should be on that consistent basis for the remainder of the contract. And as I say, hopefully the uplift is broadly covered by the MHCLG funding allocation.
Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, my point wasn't around, I appreciate you've given the breakdown and justified the uplift as well. I was just making a point in terms of that 37,000 pounds uplift that was agreed. Would have not been appropriate to add to the PSSA scale fee rather than adding it on to the fee uplift? That was the point that I'm trying to.
Thanks, Councillor. I think what we've tried to do there is be as open and transparent as possible by starting with the scale fee of 178. And then what we've done is we've added on the uplifts that we had for last year's audit, which takes you to the 238, which reconciles back to the prior year figure on the previous page. And then we've shown, well, what's new for this year, which is principally the additional work on the VFM arrangements review and the new auditing standards, principally ISA 540. So we've tried to split it out that, this is the scale fee. These are the additional areas of work that we've done in prior years that are continuing. And then these are the new elements of our audit work, which are new for 2021, which brings you overall back to the 275K. So we've tried to do it in a way that hopefully was sort of clear and transparent to show how that fee is broken down. Thanks.
Councillor Holmas, is that all right?
Chair, if it assists, just going back to the question that Councillor Trustwell asked around the questions on page 243 of the agenda pack for the committee to answer. I'm aware that there's been some discussion going on between colleagues within the financial services team, and perhaps Victoria is in the best place to talk about how the committee are going to be placed in a position where they can answer those questions satisfactorily.
Thanks, Chair. There is going to be a series of training sessions through around September time, where members will be invited to come to. There'll be it's probably going to be 4 sessions, 2 duplicates, so that you can choose which session's best for yourselves, where Mary and her team will go through the accounts in quite a lot of detail, where you'll be able to ask questions. There'll be the new requirements for your responsibilities will be covered in those sessions, and we'll go through things like value for money and estimates during that process. Okay.
Thank you, Victoria. Councillor Harrand.
Yes, Chair, I sympathise with the poverty-stricken partners of Grant Thornton. The audit fee page 254 includes £10,000 for one-off things that occurred last year, Marion House and Headingley Lease, but they've just been consolidated into the total and carried forward. Weren't they one-offs that are not going to repeat and be repeated? And why are they consolidated and treated as a base figure when they were exceptional?
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge, Councillor Allen. I mean, there will be new things that arise this year, I'm sure, given the size and complexity of Leeds accounts that are likely to be broadly equivalent to those areas during the 2021 audit. I mean, clearly, clearly we can, we can review that during the course of the audit, and obviously a finalised proposed fee will be included in the ISA 260 report in November. And there will be ongoing elements of those pieces of work that will still require review for this year, even though it will be the second year of those being booked to the Leeds accounts. If there's anything you want to add, Perminder.
I think just one further point, and that is that this is a sort of projection that we just want to make you aware of early on. Obviously, the outcome will be dependent on the actual time that gets put onto the clock. And once we know that, we'll be in a better position to provide the exact breakdown and detail to you at that time.
We'll wait and see.
Any further questions, Linda?
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry, Grant Thornton, it's another question on the fee. You mentioned, and I didn't have any questions until a few minutes ago, actually, but you mentioned that you don't envisage any further incremental change in respect of the fee for the next couple of years. I know that's a bold statement to make. Can I just ask around impending changes or amendments to ISAs over the next couple of years? I'm aware that there are a couple that potentially will impact on the work that you're required to do. What would that mean for audit fees, or haven't you thought that far ahead yet?
That's good question, Linda. I think the expectation is that this year clearly has been a real step change in terms of the proposed fees across the sector. So, in terms of value and percentage uplift for this year across the local government sector, there will be significant uplifts as is seen in the Leeds audit plan. The expectation is that uplifts of that level are not expected to take place over the next couple of years for the remainder of the PSAA contract. That said, things like IFRS 16, for example, that's due to come in a couple of years' time, that clearly will be a big piece of work. It's obviously going to be a big piece of work for Mary and the team, and will be a piece of work that auditors will need to go through. But they're not going to be at the sort of 97k level that obviously this year's is. So, the sort of lead GT partners who are engaging with the other firms and PSAA, they have set that expectation that the uplifts that are introduced this year, they're not going to be seen on a similar basis for the remainder of the contract. It is seen as a real sort of step change for this year. And then obviously things like the new auditing or accounting standards, will be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but they're unlikely to lead to anything like that. I should actually make one other point in that I'm not actually a partner at Grant Thornton, just to make a note that I am a director. Thank you, Chair.
Just a follow-on question. Thank you, Gareth, for that. The one that I'm thinking about in particular is the ISA 240, the amendments to in respect to fraud in a couple of years' time. And I think it links back to one of the councillors' questions earlier around materiality and what does that mean from a public user's perception of the accounts. I guess just one to think about going forward is where you look at arrangements that the council's already got in place or maybe should have in place to enable you to come to a conclusion around this particular one going forward. I think it would be advisable to have early conversations around that in advance of 2 years' time, if that makes sense, and not to wait until the time comes in to say to people like Louise or the finance team that they should have done something in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's in nobody's interest to leave, key discussions on new accounting or auditing developments to the last minute. So, I mean, using an IFRS 16 as an example, until COVID hit and the implementation of that got delayed, it was a standing item on discussions that we had with Mary and Victoria and Richard. So similarly, as and when, those new developments are coming forward, we will be picking those up routinely because it's in nobody's interests, obviously, to leave those key discussions till nearer the time.
Any other question? Thank you. Does the committee agree the recommendations set out on page 229 of the agenda pack to receive the annual audit plan presented by Grant Thornton and to note and agree the nature and scope of the proposed audit work? Thank you. Item 13, Kate. Work programme.
Yes, this is the work programme that members have seen before, but with some amendments in red type. If you've got a coloured printed copy of the agenda, you'll see that there's an additional item being added to the September work programme, which is the approval of the items that Grant Thornton have been speaking about this afternoon. And then to make that space, the financial planning and management report has been shuffled to the November meeting, and the procurement update that Kieran spoke about earlier has been added into the November meeting as well.
Kate, any comments from members? Does the committee agree the recommendations set out on page 261 of the agenda pack to consider and approve the work programme and meeting dates at Appendix 1? Thank you. The next meeting will take place at 2 p.m. on Friday, the 24th of September 2021. That concludes the meeting.